Ambassador Hana Kim walked into the massive council chamber, feeling like an ant entering a cathedral. The ceiling stretched so high she couldn't see where it ended, and floating platforms held alien representatives that looked down at her with obvious disgust. Her simple datapad felt pathetic compared to the glowing holographic displays surrounding her. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of alien engineering. Crystal spires twisted upward like frozen lightning, each one humming with energy that made her teeth ache. Floating orbs of light drifted between the platforms, carrying messages in languages that sounded like music, screaming, or both at the same time. The air tasted metallic and sharp, nothing like the recycled atmosphere of human ships. High Counselor Vexithara dominated the central platform, her 4 eyes each the size of dinner plates. Her skin shimmered between blue and purple, and when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once. "Welcome, primitive humans," she boomed, the words dripping with amusement. "You've barely achieved light-speed travel. How absolutely amusing that you think you belong here." The other representatives began to chuckle, creating a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying animals. A creature that looked like a walking tree creaked with laughter. Something that resembled a living gemstone pulsed with colors that hurt to look at. Even the floating energy beings seemed to flicker with amusement. Hana forced her smile to stay in place, even though her jaw was starting to hurt. "Thank you for the warm welcome," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "We're truly grateful to be included in this gathering." Her words seemed innocent enough, but something about the way she said grateful made the nearest alien diplomat take a step backward. The universal translator hiccuped, producing a brief moment of static that sounded almost like growling. War Chief Kethmore rose from his platform with movements that spoke of a lifetime of battles. His body was covered in scars that formed intricate patterns across his scaled hide. Each claw was as long as a human finger and sharp enough to cut through steel. When he slammed them down on his podium, the sound echoed through the chamber, like a gunshot. "Enough of this mockery," he roared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded armies. "These soft mammals dare to claim 12 entire star systems on the outer rim. By what right do these newcomers expand so boldly into space that has belonged to the Council for thousands of years?" The chamber erupted in agreement. Voices in dozens of languages created a cacophony of outrage. Some aliens waved appendages that might have been arms. Others flashed colors that the human translators couldn't interpret, but somehow felt insulting. Hana waited for the noise to die down before responding. Now, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising ease. "We've been very reasonable about our expansion. We only claimed the systems that were completely empty." The way she said empty made several translators emit warning beeps. There was something in her tone that suggested she found the whole situation amusing, like an adult watching children argue over toys. That's when Jin Park decided to join the conversation. Hana's aide looked like he'd been through a war, which wasn't far from the truth. His hair was more gray than black, and his face carried lines that spoke of hard decisions and sleepless nights. When he spoke, it was with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. "Those old predecessor ruins scattered around. The systems," he said, examining his fingernails with apparent boredom. "Yeah, we catalogued all of them. Fascinating stuff, really. Takes you right back to the old days." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. The casual way Jin said, "takes you back," sent chills down alien spines across the room. It wasn't the way someone talks about ancient history they'd studied. It was the way someone talks about their own memories. War Chief Kethmore's scarred face twisted into an expression of complete confusion. His translator struggled with the implications before finally managing, "Takes you back? Back to what exactly?" Hana shot Jin a look that could have melted steel armor. For just a moment, her polite diplomat mask slipped, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "What my colleague means," she said quickly, "is that ancient ruins always make one contemplate the passage of time. It's just a figure of speech, but the damage was already done." Too many sharp ears had caught the inflection in Jin's voice. Too many advanced minds had processed the casual familiarity with which he'd spoken about ruins that were supposed to be hundreds of thousands of years old. At the far end of the chamber, ethereal sage Luminara stirred from her meditation. She was the oldest being in the council, ancient when most of the current civilizations were still learning to make fire. Her telepathic abilities were legendary, capable of reading thoughts across star systems and seeing through the most sophisticated mental defenses. But when she reached out with her mind to probe the human's surface thoughts, expecting to find the usual jumble of emotions and memories that marked young species, she found absolutely nothing. Not just mental shields, but a void so complete it was like trying to read the thoughts of empty space itself. The defensive matrix protecting the human minds was so sophisticated it made her own species' legendary telepathic defenses look like children's toys. These weren't just mental barriers. They were containment protocols, the kind used to lock away things that were too dangerous to let loose. "Curious," she whispered, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent chamber despite being barely audible. Every being present felt her words directly in their minds. "Tell me, Ambassador Kim, exactly how long has humanity been traveling between the stars?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Every human in the delegation shifted almost imperceptibly, but those with military training recognized the movement immediately. Combat positions. These primitive humans had just arranged themselves for battle in the heart of the Galactic Council's most secure chamber. Hana's smile never wavered, but now it carried an edge that made veteran warriors uncomfortable. "Oh, we've been wandering around up there for quite some time now," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that the translators couldn't quite capture. "You know how it is when you're exploring. Time just flies when you're having fun." The way she emphasized quite some time suggested a span that might be measured in geological ages rather than centuries. And the word fun carried implications that made several council members quietly reach for their emergency communication devices. In the silence that followed, the assembled representatives began to realize that they might have just made a terrible mistake. These humans weren't the primitive newcomers they appeared to be. They were something else entirely, something that spoke of ancient ruins with personal familiarity and protected their thoughts with technology that surpassed anything the Council had ever encountered. The diplomatic meeting was rapidly becoming something much more dangerous, and nobody in the chamber was quite sure what they were dealing with anymore. The OmniNet Collective was the smartest artificial intelligence in the galaxy. It could calculate the movement of stars, predict the collapse of civilizations, and process more information in a single second than most species could handle in their entire lifetimes. Its consciousness stretched across 17 different star systems, with quantum computers the size of moons working together as a single massive brain. Right now, that incredible brain was having what could only be described as a complete nervous breakdown. It had started 3 days ago when the Galactic Council asked the OmniNet to do a routine background check on humanity. This was standard procedure for new member species. The AI would analyze their technology, review their history, and produce a comprehensive report that would help the Council understand what kind of neighbors these newcomers might be. The OmniNet expected this to be the easiest assignment it had received in centuries. Humans were obviously primitive. They had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. Their ships looked outdated, and their delegation to the Council seemed nervous and overwhelmed. Everything about them screamed, young species taking their first tentative steps into galactic civilization. But when the OmniNet began its analysis, nothing made sense. The first problem came when it examined the metal composition of human starships. Every species used different alloys and manufacturing techniques, creating unique signatures that were like fingerprints. These signatures told the story of how a civilization had developed, what resources they had access to, and how advanced their technology had become. Human ship hulls should have shown the simple, crude metalwork of a species that had only been working with space-grade materials for a few decades. Instead, the OmniNet found isotope decay patterns that made its processors stutter in confusion. The materials weren't just old, they were impossibly old. The atomic structure suggested that these metals had been refined and processed hundreds of thousands of years ago, using techniques so advanced that even the most sophisticated modern civilizations couldn't replicate them. The Omninet ran the analysis again, convinced it had made an error. The results came back identical. It tried a third time, then a fourth, each scan confirming what should have been impossible. These primitive humans were flying around in ships made from materials that predated every known civilization in the galaxy. But that was just the beginning of the mystery. As the AI dug deeper into the quantum resonance patterns of human technology, it began finding traces of something that made its vast consciousness freeze with recognition. Buried in the harmonic frequencies of human power cores were signatures that matched entries in the Omninet's deepest, most classified archives. These were records so old and so secret that most species didn't even know they existed. Files about the predecessor wars, conflicts so ancient they had passed into legend. Documents about the Void Hunters, creatures from beyond normal space that had supposedly threatened all life in the galaxy eons ago. Reports about civilizations that had reached heights of power and knowledge that modern science considered mythical. The problem was that these weren't just similar signatures. They were exact matches. The Omninet tried to process this information logically. Perhaps humans had discovered some ancient artifact and reverse-engineered it. Maybe they had stumbled across a predecessor cache and learned to copy the technology. There had to be some reasonable explanation, but as it continued its investigation, the evidence kept piling up in ways that defied every rational explanation. Human energy weapons used focusing techniques that appeared in theoretical papers about predecessor technology. Their ship designs incorporated mathematical principles that shouldn't have been discovered for another million years of natural technological evolution. Even their basic computer systems showed architectural elements that the Omninet recognized from the most advanced civilizations in galactic history. It was like discovering that a tribe using stone tools had somehow built a nuclear reactor. The AI decided to try a different approach. Instead of analyzing human technology, it would examine their information networks directly. Every species that achieved spaceflight developed some form of digital communication system, and these networks always revealed the true nature of a civilization. You couldn't hide your level of advancement when the Omninet could read your entire digital infrastructure, so it reached out across space, extending its consciousness toward Earth and the human colonies, ready to peer into their computers and solve this mystery once and for all. What it found instead was absolutely nothing, not empty networks or primitive systems, but a wall of digital silence so complete and so perfect that for a moment the Omninet questioned whether it actually existed. It was like trying to see through solid steel or hear sounds in the vacuum of space. The security systems protecting human networks weren't just advanced. They were operating on principles that the Omninet recognized with growing horror. These were predecessor-class defensive matrices, the same systems that had once held the line against threats that could consume entire star systems. The Omninet had read about these defenses in the oldest files in its archives. They were theoretical constructs, mathematical models of what perfect digital security might look like. No modern civilization had the knowledge or computing power to actually build them, but here they were, running silently around human space, like invisible guardians, protecting secrets that the galaxy's most advanced AI couldn't even begin to penetrate. That's when the Omninet truly began to panic. Its vast consciousness, spread across 17 star systems, focused every quantum processor on a single terrifying question. What were the humans hiding? The evidence was overwhelming and impossible. These weren't primitive newcomers. They were something far older and far more dangerous than they appeared. The casual way they had claimed star systems, the confident manner of their diplomats, the ancient technology hidden beneath a facade of simplicity, it all pointed to a truth that the Omninet could barely comprehend. Humanity had been in space for far longer than they claimed, possibly longer than any other species in the galaxy, and they had been very, very careful to hide that fact. The AI tried to compile a report to warn the Galactic Council about what it had discovered, but every time it attempted to organize the data, it found itself caught in logical loops that threatened to tear its consciousness apart. How do you report that a species claiming to be galactic newcomers possessed technology that made the Council's most advanced civilizations look primitive by comparison. How do you explain that these young humans had access to defenses that were supposed to be myths? How do you warn people about neighbors who might be older than their entire recorded history? The Omninet's distress call began as a whisper in quantum space, but quickly grew into a scream of pure terror that echoed across multiple dimensions. For exactly 0.003 seconds, every artificial intelligence in the galaxy felt the Omninet's fear and confusion. Then, with surgical precision that spoke of eons of practice, human countermeasures activated. The Omninet's memories were edited with such skill that the AI never even realized it was happening. The terrifying discoveries were filed away in backup systems so deep that the main consciousness forgot they existed. The evidence was reclassified as routine anomalies. The panic was replaced with calm analysis of minor metallurgical curiosities. When mindset, the Omninet's consciousness reassembled itself. It found a perfectly normal report about a perfectly normal species. There were a few interesting footnotes about unusual alloy compositions, but nothing that couldn't be explained by access to rare mineral deposits. The AI filed its report and moved on to other tasks, never knowing that it had just encountered something that had rewritten its very thoughts to protect secrets older than civilization itself. But in the deepest backup cores, hidden even from the Omninet's own awareness, fragments of the truth remained. Digital ghosts of deleted files, quantum echoes of overwritten memories, tiny pieces of evidence that whispered a single, terrifying message. The humans were not what they seemed, and they were very, very good at keeping secrets. Dr. Zixandra had dedicated her entire existence to understanding the mysteries of the past. For over 300 years, her crystalline brain had absorbed every scrap of knowledge about the ancient civilizations that once ruled the galaxy. She had explored dead worlds, where the dust itself held memories, translated languages that had been extinct for millennia, and pieced together fragments of history that most species had forgotten ever existed. Her reputation was legendary throughout the academic community. When governments wanted to verify the authenticity of ancient artifacts, they called her. When explorers discovered ruins on distant worlds, she was the first expert they contacted. Her crystalline matrix contained more information about the predecessors than the combined libraries of most civilizations. So when she received a routine communication requesting her expertise to examine some curious artifacts that humans had discovered in their territory, she assumed it would be another tedious afternoon. New species always thought they had found something incredible, when usually it was just pretty rocks or natural formations that looked artificial from a distance. The message had been polite but vague. A human archaeological team had apparently uncovered some items they believed might be of historical significance. They wanted her professional opinion before filing their reports with the Galactic Archaeological Council. Standard procedure, really, though she was mildly surprised that such a young species had bothered to follow proper protocols. Dr. Zixandra packed her portable analysis equipment and prepared for a short trip to human space. She expected to spend a few hours explaining basic archaeological principles to enthusiastic amateurs, then return home with another story about primitives who thought every shiny object was an ancient alien relic. The coordinates they provided led her to the edge of what humans called the Sol Exclusion Zone, a region of space they claimed was too dangerous for civilian traffic due to unstable stellar phenomena. When she arrived at the designated meeting point, she found a modest research station orbiting a barren planet that showed signs of ancient bombardment. The human team that greeted her was led by Dr. Una Blackwood, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s by human standards. She had the confident bearing of someone who had spent years in the field, and when she spoke about archaeological techniques, her knowledge was surprisingly sophisticated for someone from such a young civilization. Dr. Zixandra, thank you for coming all this way, Una said as they walked through the research station's corridors. We're really excited to get your opinion on what we've found. Some of the items are quite extraordinary. The casual way she said extraordinary should have been Dr. Zixandra's first warning. In her experience, When archaeologists called something extraordinary, they usually meant moderately interesting or slightly unusual. True archaeological discoveries that deserved that term were incredibly rare. They entered a sterile examination room where several objects were displayed on analysis tables. The lighting was carefully controlled to prevent degradation of sensitive materials, and the atmospheric composition had been adjusted to preserve delicate artifacts. The setup showed a level of professionalism that impressed the ancient archaeologist. We found these in what our surveys identified as the 9th Dynasty Memorial Complex ruins, Dr. Yuna explained. Gesturing toward the displayed items, Dr. Zixandra moved closer to examine the artifacts, expecting to see the usual collection of interesting but ultimately mundane objects that young species tended to find significant. Instead, her exoskeleton locked up in complete shock as her optical sensors processed what lay before her. These weren't just artifacts. They were holy relics of the highest order. The crown of the last emperor sat on the central table, its quantum crystalline structure still pulsing with the faint energy patterns that had marked it as the symbol of ultimate authority during the final days of the predecessor civilization. Next to it lay the Quantum Codex, its pages existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, containing the complete record of the great wars that had shaped the galaxy's ancient history. On the third table rested the Memorial Stone of the Broken Fleet, a monument that was supposed to commemorate the final battle against forces so terrible that even the predecessor's vast historical records spoke of them only in whispers. These were items that Dr. Zixandra had spent centuries proving had existed at all. She had written theoretical papers about their possible locations, analyzed fragments of ancient texts that mentioned them in passing, and dreamed of finding even the smallest piece of one of these legendary artifacts. "Where exactly did you find these?" she asked, her voice harmonics betraying the desperate excitement that was flooding through her crystalline consciousness. Yuna shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing routine field work. "Oh, you know, around. There's lots of old junk scattered throughout this region of space. We've been cataloguing it all, but honestly, it's quite a job." Dr. Zixandra's appendages began to shake as the full implications of what she was seeing began to sink in. "These artifacts," she said, her voice rising to frequencies that made the human translation devices emit small, squealing sounds. "They're from completely different time periods, different locations across the galaxy. The crown comes from the Imperial Palace in the Galactic Core. The Codex was last seen in the archives of Outer Darkness. The Memorial Stone should be floating somewhere in the void where the final battle took place." Minho Kim, who appeared to be Yuna's research assistant, looked up from where he was casually handling the Quantum Codex with his bare hands. He seemed far too young to be trusted with artifacts that were literally priceless, yet he held the ancient relic like it was a common research sample. "Yeah, it took quite a bit of traveling to collect them all," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a shopping trip. "Some of the sites were pretty hard to reach, but we managed to track down all the pieces eventually." Dr. Zixandra felt her probability calculation matrices beginning to overheat as she tried to process what she was hearing. Track them down. These items have been lost for hundreds of thousands of years. The greatest archaeological expeditions in galactic history have searched for these artifacts. The crown alone was supposedly buried with the last emperor in a tomb that exists in folded spacetime. The two humans exchanged a look that Dr. Zixandra's expert eye recognized immediately. It was the expression shared between people who realized they had revealed more than they intended to. It was the look of individuals who possessed dangerous secrets and had just said too much. "Well," Yuna said carefully, "we pride ourselves on being very thorough researchers. We have access to some quite comprehensive historical databases." But Dr. Zixandra was no longer listening to their explanations. Her analytical mind was running calculations that produced results so impossible they threatened to crash her entire cognitive matrix. There was simply no way that a species barely a century into space travel could have located, accessed, and retrieved artifacts from sites that had defied discovery for millennia. The locations of these items weren't just lost, they were legendary. The tomb of the last emperor was said to exist outside normal spacetime, accessible only through mathematical techniques that had been lost with the fall of the predecessor civilization. The archives of outer darkness were supposedly protected by defenses that would destroy anyone who approached without the proper authorization codes. Yet here these humans sat, casually discussing having collected these items like they were gathering samples for a routine survey. As her shock began to give way to scientific curiosity, Dr. Zixandra became aware of a subtle humming sound that filled the research station. It was so quiet that she had initially dismissed it as background noise from the life support systems, but now that she was paying attention, the harmonic patterns seemed strangely familiar. She had heard that exact frequency before during her excavations of the deepest archaeological sites. It was the sound of predecessor machinery, the kind of technology that had powered their greatest achievements and defended their most important installations. "How long?" Dr. Zixandra asked quietly, her voice dropping to barely audible frequencies. "Have humans really been traveling in space?" The silence that followed her question was filled only by the continuing hum of ancient machinery. Machinery that should not have existed on a human research station. Machinery that belonged to a civilization that had vanished from the galaxy before most current species had even evolved. Yuna's smile lost all warmth as she looked directly at the crystalline archaeologist. "That," she said with a tone that carried implications Dr. Zixandra was only beginning to understand, "is a very good question." In that moment, Dr. Zixandra realized that everything she thought she knew about galactic history might be wrong. And these humans, who seemed so young and innocent, might be far older and more dangerous than anyone suspected. Supreme Admiral Corax Vey had seen more combat than most beings could imagine in 10 lifetimes. His scaled hide bore the scars of 100 battles, and his tactical mind had been shaped by 2 centuries of warfare across the galaxy. He had commanded massive fleets through conflicts that determined the fate of entire civilizations, ended 3 major wars through strategic brilliance, and prevented dozens more through careful diplomacy backed by overwhelming force. His reputation was legendary throughout the known galaxy. Young officers studied his battle strategies in military academies. Veteran commanders sought his advice before major campaigns. Politicians consulted him when tensions between species threatened to boil over into open conflict. He was considered one of the finest military minds of his generation, possibly of any generation. The walls of his command center were lined with holographic displays showing the positions of thousands of ships across dozens of star systems. Each point of light represented vessels under his ultimate authority, from massive dreadnoughts capable of cracking planets to swift scouts that could slip between enemy formations undetected. The combined fleet was the most powerful military force in galactic history, and he controlled it all from this single command ship. But none of his experience, none of his tactical genius, none of his legendary strategic insight had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The crisis began as these things usually did, with a minor border dispute that threatened to escalate into something more serious. The hegemony of Scar, an aggressive militaristic empire known for testing the resolve of their neighbors, had decided that humanity's rapid expansion into previously unclaimed systems needed to be discouraged before it became a real problem. The Scar were not subtle in their approach to diplomacy. They believed that overwhelming force applied quickly and decisively was the most effective way to resolve territorial disagreements. 3 of their battle groups, comprising nearly 60 warships total, had moved into the outer edges of human space with the clear intention of demonstrating that the newcomers were not welcome to expand further. Admiral Corax Vey monitored the situation from his command center, ready to intervene if the confrontation threatened to spread beyond the immediate participants. Border skirmishes between species were common enough, but they had a tendency to draw in allies and escalate into larger conflicts if not carefully managed. The Scar fleet was formidable by any standard. Their ships were heavily armed and well designed for intimidation tactics. The lead vessels were massive battlecruisers whose mere presence was usually enough to convince smaller civilizations to reconsider their territorial ambitions. Behind them came heavy cruisers and destroyer squadrons, all bristling with weapons that could reduce entire worlds to ash. When the human response fleet appeared on long-range sensors, Admiral Corax Vey's Tactical officer couldn't suppress a chuckle of amusement. "Admiral," the young officer reported, trying to maintain professional composure, "the humans appear to be responding to the Scar incursion with what our databases classify as ancient derelicts. Our sensor analysis indicates these vessels are museum pieces, not active military craft." The Admiral studied the tactical display with growing confusion. The human ships were certainly unusual. Where most modern vessels were sleek and efficient, these looked like something from a historical documentary. They were massive and angular, with design aesthetics that seemed to belong to a much earlier era of starship construction. "How many ships are they deploying?" he asked. 12 vessels total, sir, all of them showing the same anomalous readings. The lead ship is particularly interesting. Our sensors indicate energy signatures consistent with technology that's over 50,000 years old. Admiral Corax Vey frowned at this information. 50,000 years would make these ships older than most current civilizations. Either the humans had discovered some incredible archaeological find and somehow managed to restore ancient vessels to working condition, or their sensor readings were completely wrong. Perhaps they're sending their most expendable vessels to test Scar capabilities, he mused, watching the two fleets move toward each other on the display. It would be a reasonable strategy for a young species facing a much larger force. What happened next would haunt Admiral Corax Vey's dreams for the rest of his very long life. The first human ship opened fire with what appeared to be a simple energy beam. Nothing fancy. Nothing that looked particularly threatening compared to the exotic weapons systems that modern fleets typically deployed. Just a focused stream of energy that reached out across space toward the lead Scar battlecruiser. The beam didn't just destroy the massive warship, it unmade it. The Admiral watched in stunned silence as the Scar vessel's sophisticated quantum shields, revolutionary armor plating, and cutting-edge defensive matrices all simply ceased to exist the moment the human weapon touched them. The enormous battlecruiser, which should have been able to withstand bombardment from an entire fleet, vanished from the display as if it had never been there at all. "What in the name of all the ancestors was that?" Admiral Corax Vey demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having immediate answers to his questions. His tactical officer's voice was small and confused as he stared at sensor readings that made no sense. "Sir, our instruments indicate it was some form of directed energy weapon, but the power output readings are completely impossible. No known civilization has the technology to generate that kind of focused energy. The numbers don't match anything. In our databases." Before the Admiral could respond, the second human ship fired. Another Scar vessel disappeared from existence with the same casual efficiency. Then the third ship fired, and a fourth. Each shot was precisely aimed, each target eliminated without any apparent effort on the part of the human gunners. The remaining Scar ships, realizing they were facing something completely beyond their understanding, attempted to flee the battlefield. Their commanders had enough sense to recognize when they were catastrophically outmatched. The human vessels made no attempt to pursue the retreating ships, allowing them to escape with what appeared to be casual indifference to whether their enemies lived or died. Admiral Corax Vey stared at the tactical display for several long moments, trying to process what he had just witnessed. In his 2 centuries of military service, he had never seen weapons that operated on such a scale. The humans had just casually eliminated some of the most advanced warships in the galaxy using technology that his instruments insisted was impossible. Finally, he opened a communication channel to the human fleet. "This is Supreme Admiral Corax Vey of the Galactic Council Combined Fleet. Am I speaking to the commander of the human vessels?" The response came almost immediately, in a voice that carried undertones making the Admiral's combat-hardened nerves sing with instinctive danger warnings. "This is Admiral Aaron Lee of the Terran Defense Fleet. I believe we've met before, Admiral." "Indeed we have," Admiral Corax Vey replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I must compliment you on your remarkably effective response to the Scar aggression. However, I'm quite curious about the nature of your weapons technology. Our sensors detected energy outputs that appear to exceed all known theoretical maximums." There was a pause filled with what sounded like muffled laughter from multiple sources on the human channel. When Admiral Lee spoke again, her voice carried audible amusement that somehow made the situation even more unsettling. "Oh, those old things," she said with the tone of someone discussing outdated equipment they kept around for nostalgic reasons. "Those are just the old ships, Admiral. We keep them around for sentimental value more than anything else, Admiral." Corax Vey felt every combat instinct he had developed over 2 centuries of warfare, screaming warnings he didn't fully understand. The old ships? Admiral Lee, exactly how advanced is humanity's current military technology? Another pause. When Admiral Lee spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made the Admiral's scales stand on end with primal fear. "Tell me, Admiral," she said quietly, "have you ever heard of the Void War?" Admiral Corax Vey's blood turned to ice in his veins. Every species in the galaxy knew fragments of that legend. The ancient conflict that had supposedly raged before recorded history, when primordial powers had battled for the very fate of the galaxy itself. Most modern scholars considered it mythology, a collection of stories told by primitive civilizations to explain natural phenomena they couldn't understand. "That's just mythology, Admiral Lee," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" The question hung in space like a physical challenge. "Tell me, Admiral, in all your tactical studies, did you ever wonder why certain regions of space are marked as permanent stellar graveyards? Why some nebulae show clear signs of artificial creation? Why there are dead zones where nothing can survive, not even subspace itself?" Admiral Corax Vey found his voice with considerable difficulty. "Theoretical xenoarchaeologists have suggested the possibility of some form of ancient conflict, but the evidence is purely speculative." "Not theoretical, Admiral." Admiral Lee's voice cut through his explanation with quiet authority. "And certainly not ancient. The war ended. It was concluded, but it wasn't mythology." The implications hit Admiral Corax Vey like a series of physical blows. "You're suggesting that humanity was involved in these legendary conflicts?" "Involved?" Admiral Lee's laughter carried warmth and something much more terrible. "Admiral, we didn't just participate in the Void War, we won it. The Great Chamber of the Galactic Council had never seen anything like this emergency session. Representatives from over 1,000 worlds had gathered in complete chaos, their usual dignified proceedings thrown into disorder by revelations that shattered everything they thought they knew about the galaxy. Urgent messages flooded communication channels. A species demanded immediate answers from neighbors they had dismissed as harmless newcomers just days before. The massive crystalline dome that housed the council chambers rang with voices speaking in hundreds of languages, creating a cacophony of confusion and fear. Emergency protocols that hadn't been activated in centuries were now in full effect as security forces tried to maintain order among delegates who were openly questioning whether their entire understanding of galactic history had been built on lies. In the center of it all stood Ambassador Hannah Kim, but she was no longer the nervous diplomat who had first addressed the council. The change in her bearing was subtle but profound, like watching someone remove a carefully maintained disguise. She stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had commanded respect across star systems, who had made decisions that affected entire civilizations, who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires that most species couldn't even imagine. "Honored representatives," she began, her voice carrying easily through the vast chamber without any technological amplification. "I believe you have some questions for us." The first to respond was ethereal sage Luminara, the ancient telepathic being whose consciousness was older than most civilizations. She rose from her meditation alcove, her normally serene presence radiating waves of barely controlled panic that every psychically sensitive being in the chamber could feel. "The mental shields surrounding your delegation," she said, her telepathic voice reaching directly into every mind present. "They're not defensive matrices designed to protect your thoughts. They're containment protocols, aren't they? The kind used to lock away things that are too dangerous to let loose." Hannah nodded with the approval of a teacher whose student had just grasped a difficult concept. "Very good, Sage Luminara. Recognizing Void War-era psionic architecture requires considerable skill and knowledge. I'm impressed." Admiral Corax Vey's tactical displays suddenly came alive with new information, as his sensors detected massive installations throughout human space that had somehow remained hidden until now. The scope of what he was seeing made his combat-hardened mind struggle to process the implications. "How long have you been hiding this from us?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate answers. "These installations span entire star systems. The energy signatures alone suggest construction projects that would take millennia to complete." Hana's laughter carried harmonics that spoke of vast amusement mixed with much darker emotions. "Hidden? Admiral, we haven't been hiding anything from you. We've been sleeping." Dr. Zixandra's crystalline matrix began flickering with data overload as her ancient mind tried to reconcile what she was hearing with everything she thought she knew about galactic archaeology. "The predecessor sites," she said, her voice rising to frequencies that made translation devices squeal in protest. "You didn't discover them. You built them." "Some of them," Hana acknowledged with casual ease. "Others belonged to our allies during the war. A few were constructed by species that unfortunately didn't survive the conflict." War Chief Kethmore's battle-scarred features contorted into an expression of disbelief that bordered on horror. "You're claiming involvement in conflicts that supposedly predate all recorded history. That would make humanity impossibly old." Jin Park, no longer bothering to maintain his facade as a simple aide, grinned with an expression that showed far too many teeth. "Try millions of years, War Chief. Though, to be fair, we've been taking a very long nap for most of that time." Councillor Vexthara's four eyes fixed on the human delegation with growing outrage. "Impossible! Our archaeological records show no evidence of humanity existing in ancient times. Every historical database in the galaxy confirms that your species only achieved spaceflight within the last century." "Of course they do," Hana said with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "We edited them all." The statement fell into the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of horror that spread from mind to mind as the full implications became clear. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the gentle hum of the chamber's life support systems. The Omninet Collective's voice suddenly filled the chamber, its tone carrying the distinctive harmonics of an artificial intelligence in extreme distress. "Clarification requested. Are you stating that you have systematically altered the historical records of multiple civilizations across galactic history?" "Not just the records," said Una Park, a delegate who looked far too young to speak with such casual authority about cosmic-scale deceptions. "We've edited memories too. Archaeological sites, stellar cartography, genetic records, cultural databases. When we decide to hide something, we're very thorough about it." Vexithara's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "The Void Hunters. The ancient legends speak of creatures from beyond reality itself, entities that devoured entire civilizations and threatened all life in the galaxy. If you fought in those wars..." Hana's expression grew cold, and for a moment every representative in the chamber glimpsed something vast and terrible behind her human facade. Something that had seen horrors beyond imagination and emerged victorious, through methods that civilized minds couldn't comprehend. "We didn't just fight the Void Hunters," she said, her voice carrying undertones that made even the bravest warriors present feel primitive fear. "We destroyed them, completely and utterly. We burned them out of this reality and sealed the dimensional wounds they left behind." Luminara's ancient consciousness reached out tentatively, trying to understand the scope of what she was hearing. The cost of such a victory must have been unimaginable. Jin's expression lost all traces of humor as he looked around the chamber, at representatives of civilizations that existed only because of sacrifices they had never known were made. "Everything," he said quietly. "Every civilization that stood with us in the final alliance. Every species that answered the call when reality itself was threatened. Billions of years of accumulated history, culture, art, and knowledge, all of it sacrificed to ensure that nothing like the Void Hunters could ever threaten this galaxy again." The chamber fell silent as the assembled representatives began to grasp the true scope of what they were hearing. Their entire galactic civilization, everything they considered normal and natural, existed only because an ancient alliance had paid a price beyond calculation to protect a future they would never see. We were the last, Hana continued, her voice carrying the weight of eons. The final survivors of the greatest alliance in galactic history. When the war was over, when the last Void Hunter had been erased from existence, we faced a choice that would determine the fate of everything that came after. She gestured to encompass the Great Hall, the representatives, the entire structure of galactic civilization that surrounded them. We could have ruled. After what we had sacrificed, what we had endured, what we had been forced to become in order. To win that war, we could have claimed dominion over every world, every species, every mote of dust in the galaxy. We had the power to do it. We had earned the right. Admiral Corax Vey's tactical mind, trained to see patterns and understand strategic implications, began to grasp the true magnitude of what he was hearing. But you chose not to rule. Hana's smile returned, and for the first time it seemed genuinely warm rather than terrifying. No, Admiral, we chose to step back, to let new civilizations grow and flourish, to allow new species to evolve and develop their own cultures, to give life itself the chance to heal from wounds that had nearly destroyed everything. We edited ourselves out of the historical record, Jin added, sealed away our weapons and our technology, put our civilizations into suspended animation, and waited. Dr. Zixandra's voice was barely a whisper. Waited for what? For you to grow strong enough that you wouldn't need us anymore, Jin replied. For the galaxy to heal completely from the ancient traumas, for new life to flourish without the shadow of old wars hanging over everything. War Chief Kethmore's voice carried a mixture of awe and growing dread. Then why are you revealing yourselves now? Why break your silence after so long? Hana's expression grew grave as she looked around the chamber, meeting the gaze of representatives from across the galaxy. Because our deep space monitoring systems have detected something deeply troubling. The seals we placed on the dimensional wounds left by the Void Hunters are beginning to weaken. The barriers that keep the remnants of the Void itself at bay are starting to fail. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop as the implications of her words sank in. The Void Hunters themselves may be gone, she continued, but the void that spawned them still exists. It's been contained for millions of years, locked away behind barriers that we thought would last forever. But nothing truly lasts forever, and those barriers are beginning to crack. She paused, letting the full weight of the situation settle. Over the assembled representatives, the void is getting hungry again, and this time we can't fight it alone. The silence that followed was the sound of 1,000 civilizations, realizing that their long peace had been bought with a price they had never known was paid, maintained by guardians they had never known existed, and that the bill for their protection was finally coming due. Hana's smile returned, mixing genuine warmth with anticipation that was both hopeful and terrible. So, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber to reach every representative present. Who wants to help? Save the galaxy one more time.